Now, obviously, this is what you came here for. This is the Necromancer. This is what is the only thing that I know about. So let's really dig into these changes because on paper, they don't look like super impactful, but I think that they actually go a long way to address some of the disparity between some of the underutilized skills and the underutilized builds, at least from the community's perspective. For whatever reason, community thinks that like darkness builds aren't just like absolutely god tier awesome. They super are. They're wicked powerful, and they just got more powerful here. But don't let me get ahead of myself. Let's talk about the changes individually. So first, we have a change to Enhanced Bone Spirit. And let me pull that up for you so you can actually see what Enhanced Bone Spirit even did in the first place. Enhanced Bone Spirit says, if Bone Spirit were to critically strike, which on a Bone Spirit build, you are attempting to reach 100% chance to critically strike on your endgame gear, its cooldown was reduced by 6 seconds. Typically, Bone Spirit has a 12-second cooldown, so this would cut your cooldown in half. Now, obviously, with cooldown reduction as well as rapid ossification, spending a ton of essence would further reduce it. So in a real sense, on your endgame build, this just meant that you could kind of cast Bone Spirit whenever you had your monsters already set up with Corpse Tendrils, which meant that you could cast it on every single pack. So the change here, increasing the reduction from 6 seconds to 17 seconds, right? It's like a 16% increase of reduction there. It's effectively having an additional 16% effective, cooldown reduction if you didn't have any on your character, is pretty palpable. Who may not already have like a reduction in cooldown on the gear, which also got nerfed in the patch. So this is kind of helping to make the early game Bone Spirit build feel a little bit better. That's good. Like, don't get me wrong, like that is good. We have to remember the fact that not everybody is already level 100, myself included, and we're not all on endgame gear. I think in general, with all of the nerfs that happened to the Bone Tree, specifically to target Bone Spear, I think that Bone Spirit actually needs a little bit more here. I don't think that like the damage needs to go up, but like the inherent ability to be able to generate more essence after Bone Spirit has hit an enemy, I think like this needs to get buffed a little bit. I think this needs to get buffed a little bit. Quite honestly, I think that Bone Spirit got like kind of super mega nerfed, but for no reason. And it was because of Bone Spear. So while this helps, I don't think that it's enough right now, but it's good to see that they even have it on their radar. Now, this is probably the juiciest one. Now, in reality, Exposed Flesh is actually the juiciest one, and I'm both super excited and angry about this one. But let's talk about Wither first. Wither legendary node was a very interesting legendary node on the Necromancer because it is inherently tied to, and let me just pull it up so you can see it. It is inherently tied to increasing your shadow damage over time effects. So this wouldn't affect Shadow Blight because Shadow Blight is an instance of damage, but this would buff your Blight pool damage over time. This would also affect your Blighted Corpse explosion damage over time. If you're using Ultimate Shadow, this would change the damage over time effects from your Blood Wave and your Bone Storm. But what it says is that you have a base chance to increase your dot damage by 50%. So it's a 1.5 multiplier 5% of the time. Now here's the weird part though. The chance is increased by 1%, so you can gain additional chance for this to proc and deal additional damage from willpower. Now why is willpower an interesting choice here? Well, darkness builds in general don't really need willpower for kind of anything. You might go, well, like what does willpower even do on your character? Willpower is going to increase your resource generation, which darkness skills legitimately just do not care about in any way, shape, or form, since every darkness build is a corpse explosion build. So every darkness build has Grim Harvest, as well as like the most powerful ones being Infamous, literally like not even having resource spenders. It also increases your healing received, which is not nothing, but in like legitimate endgame scenarios just kind of doesn't matter. And then increases your overpower damage, something that dot damage cannot do. So by building a lot of willpower on your character, you're making it so that your dot damage can effectively crit, but for a stat that doesn't matter to you. So let me just like give you an example of like what these numbers would look like the maximum amount of willpower you could like feasibly have, which, how much you can actually get just by purely scaling willpower. I think it's a little bit over like 12 or 1300, but let's just like look at the numbers very quickly. So the node says you have a base 5% chance for this to happen and that you'll gain 1% bonus per 50 willpower. Let's just say you have 1200 willpower. Let's just say you did that on a darkness build for some reason. Now let's divide that by 50. So you would gain 24% chance for this to happen if you just had 1200 willpower. So this would be proccing 29% of the time. Now, it's not just the chance to proc, right? Let's also look at the damage bonus. So similarly, You have 24 here, and then you would gain 2.5% additional multiplicative damage. So we need to multiply this by 2.5. So you would gain 60% additional multiplicative damage, which actually is like a good chunk of damage, right? That means that in total, you were gaining 110% multiplicative damage. So you're gaining a new 2.1 multiplier on your damage. That one's actually like kind of significant. It just requires you to have 1200 willpower on a build that doesn't care about willpower. As such, the Wither node, while absolutely required on darkness builds, in general didn't really feel that great, because in reality, like, how much willpower do you end up getting up to? Let's say actually 600. Let's just like cut these numbers in half. That means that you were only gaining 12% additional chance. So it was only proccing 17% of the time, and you're only getting 30% additional damage. So it was a 0.8 multiplier. Sure, that's like great. Again, you're gonna use it. It just didn't feel that good. Let's go ahead and look at what the changes are now. So now they're reducing the requirements down to 40 from 50. So that is a 20% reduction in what you need to get a bonus. And then on top of that, they're actually increasing the damage up to 4%. So this is a 60% increase in the damage bonus. So if we look at our numbers again, so instead, let's say, let's use the 600 willpower example, because I think that that's much more reasonable for what people are going to have. Divide that by 40. So here, we are now gaining a 15% chance for it to happen, as opposed to what we were getting before, which is 12%. So it's a 3% increase. Again, that's not like super crazy, but on your average amount of willpower for a character that's not maxing this out, this is now going to be proccing 20% of the time. So 1/5 of the time for your dot damage to effectively crit. I think it was pretty reasonable. And then if we look at the other number here, so we're having 15, and before it would have been 2.5. So before this would have been only a 37.5 damage bonus here. Let's instead bring that back down, and then just go ahead and multiply by 4. I mean, it's going to be 60. We know what it is, but it's going to be 60. So now for the average amount of willpower you're probably going to get without trying to maximize all of this, you're now going to be proccing this 20% of the time. And on top of that, you're going to be dealing a total of 1.1 damage, because we're getting this 60% bonus from the increase in damage. 20% chance to gain a 2.1 multiplier on your average willpower for a darkness build. Literally just free damage increase, because you kind of don't need to change anything about your build at all to just gain this additional bonus. And that's pretty nice. I think that that's a reasonable change. Again, I think darkness builds are kind of already strong enough, but this being able to do this extra damage this much more often is going to help builds. And we need to look outside of the season, right? We need to be looking at Eternal as well, because these season bonuses are going to go away at some point, and we're going to have different seasonal stuff. But the Eternal Realm for darkness builds just gained a pretty decent sizable increase in damage, and also makes actually like building into willpower a slightly more desirable build path. You might be worrying more about picking it up in your Paragon. You might be worrying more about like all stats on your gear or willpower on your gear, if you can manage that. I still don't think it's like a complete build around mechanic, but I do think that it's cool that if you said like, sure, I'm going to build into willpower to max out this one thing, you can build into it and get a lot more out of it, which I think ultimately is like the true test of diversity amongst builds. And just like the player agency is like, if you want to build around something, you should be rewarded for doing it. And I think this goes a long way to help that. Now, the two legendary aspects that were changed here are cool. They're very, very good. I have a gripe with exposed flesh, but we'll get to that in a second. Empowering Reaper was an aspect that just did not make sense before. So let's go ahead and look at Empowering Reaper so that you get a better idea of what it did. So Empowering Reaper. Let me make sure I'm not covering this with my big head. Okay. Empowering Reaper previously said, and here, you know what, just to show its best case scenario, let's go ahead and throw it onto a two-handed weapon. So Empowering Reaper on a two-handed weapon, keep this in mind, said that critical strikes from Sever had a 40% chance to spawn a pool of Blight, which dealt bonus damage. It can only happen once every 3 seconds. Remember that Sever can hit a target 4 times. Each instance of that can't crit, but you were forced to be a crit build, which you would be on Sever, don't get me wrong, which can't get up to 100% chance to crit. So it was, you had to crit, and then it had to roll this 40% chance to then spawn Blight. Blight being a damage over time effect, which doesn't benefit from crit in any way, shape, or form, and it could only happen once every 3 seconds. This, you just did not use this aspect. It was just trash, and it's currently trash until they change this. There's no way of beating around this bush. It was designed in a way that was very cool. Like Adam Jackson goes into like why they thought the fantasy of it was very cool, and I agree, it is a very cool ability. Except you're a Sever build that's a crit build, and now you're adding AoE dot damage that doesn't crit 40% of the time if you successfully crit with a timer on it. So that's just bad. And this is in the case of using it on a two-handed weapon. Typically, it is a 20% chance to occur on crit unless you put it onto an amulet. And the damage bonus is kind of laughable. Now what they've changed it to is just Sever has a 20% chance for this to happen. You no longer need to crit, which is cool. It allows you to legitimately like put this into a build in an extra slot. I still don't think that it makes it into like the end game proc version of a Sever build. Obviously, Sever would like to be able to proc Shadow Blight more often. As we've all realized with Darkness builds, Shadow Blight like is the key to outputting a ton of damage. And being able to add in this little benefit of Blight onto the aspect, considering it is in the Codex of Power, I think is cool enough. That's like pretty decent. Now let's talk about Exposed Flesh, because it's really interesting, kind of the problem with Exposed Flesh. And don't get me wrong, this is a very, very good change. For people who hadn't seen it before, Exposed Flesh is kind of like arguably the best essence generation aspect that the Necromancer had available to it, other than a max roll Umbral for the majority of builds. Now, obviously, like Potent Blood on a Bloodlance build is a completely different story. We're not worrying about that just yet. But what it said previously is that you had up to a 10% chance, so pretty low roll, but with enough lucky hit chance and enough like on your gear and using a good skill like Bone Spear, you could generate 50 essence when you hit a vulnerable enemy with a bone skill. Now, the funny part was like Bone Spirit, the build that really wants to be able to generate hundreds of essence very quickly, only calculated lucky hit once per cast, even if it dealt damage to a ton of different monsters. So the only build that could legitimately use this was Bone Spear, and then to a much smaller degree, some builds with Bone Storm, since that has like a okay amount of lucky hit, but it's per cast because this isn't per damage, so it might proc once when you walk into a group of monsters. This was legitimately a Bone Spear aspect. The change that they've made to it is that it now is just if you hit a vulnerable target, you have a 10% chance to generate a ton of essence. So this now becomes an option on Sever, because Blight's already fine. Blight applies multiple CC effects to the target simultaneously, and with Umbral is free to cast on a pack of monsters. Now against a boss, obviously you can't CC them, so you're not getting the Umbral procs, but you were fine on a Blight build. This really opens up for Sever, because Sever naturally applies vulnerable to its target, even if it's not using Corpse Tendrils. It can also use Corpse Tendrils to apply vulnerable. But let's talk about what build would really, really love to be able to generate a ton of essence very quickly, and that is your blood builds. You think that Bone Spear is the hungriest build in the game. You think that Bone Spirit is the hungriest necro build in the game. That's just untrue. The hungriest Necromancer builds in this game are blood builds. Now, what's the problem with this aspect? Blood builds don't use vulnerable, because vulnerable doesn't scale overpower damage. So you never use vulnerable. On top of that, very specifically, the easy way of applying vulnerable that you have in your skill tree, Corpse Tendrils, is allowing you to apply vulnerable right here. But on Bloodlance, you use Corpse Tendrils to generate blood orbs, because you're using Potent Blood to be able to generate a ton of essence, especially with the addition of Gore Quill automatically consuming blood orbs. Blood builds want the blood orbs, because the blood orbs are one of the fastest ways to be able to generate essence incredibly quickly. On top of that, they come along with a ton of additional bonuses, and we'll get to one of them that's going to be super relevant very soon. But they heal you, they can overheal you for different aspects that interact with overhealing, and then they also generate Fortify for you, something that blood builds desperately want to be able to generate as fast as possible, because that's their base damage scaling. Exposed Flesh is an incredibly powerful essence generation tool, which already worked for the builds that used it, can now be used on Sever, which again is very good. You know, don't get it twisted. It's awesome that Sever can now use this too. But blood builds don't apply vulnerable, and they are the most essence hungry builds in the game. And if you legitimately believe that a blood build is going to swap over to applying vulnerable just to have a 10% lucky hit chance of generating essence, you're high. That's just, it's not going to happen. Now, I'm personally going to test it out just to make sure that I'm not eating my own words here, but I have like a really big issue right now where blood builds are, where They specifically talk about Overpower, and maybe I'll share the clip. They understand that Overpower is in a bad spot because it doesn't scale the way that other damage types does. It doesn't interact with as many game conditions as the other types do. And they give us the best essence generation aspect that's in the game right now for Necros, and it can't work for the build that is the most hungry and needs this the most. I think that that's a huge problem. I just wish it didn't have to hit a vulnerable target. Put in some other type of like requirement for this aspect. I don't even know. Make it so it only works against monsters who aren't healthy, maybe. You know, keep it in the concept of exposed flesh, right? You've dealt damage to them. They're no longer healthy. They're bleeding. They have gashes in them. Now it can work on that target, maybe. It also means that like corpse tendrils can effectively trigger this for you against a bunch of different enemies. And that might be one of the ways that like builds continue to be able to use it. So maybe they don't even necessarily care about like having the vulnerable status up if corpse tendrils can very quickly generate a ton of essence. But that can already happen with the umbral aspect. Like this is kind of my problem. Like even in ways where I try to come up with a different scenario where it can work, there are other aspects that already fill that gap for us. I'm not saying every single thing needs to work for every single Necromancer build, but this is clearly trying to open up for not just bone, and it's not open enough. So maybe if we could take another whack at this, again, maybe it works on enemies that are no longer healthy, so then it just kind of works across the board and it works in all scenarios. It opens up once you have a boss down below 80%. It works on packs of monsters. It works on builds that don't just one-shot everything on the screen. That would be super duper cool. I think that would be a great way to open it up. Then we have a couple different aspects which have changed. So aspect of Decay is going to see its base damage increase. This is, again, great for Shadowblight builds, for Darkness builds. Darkness builds are eating so good right now, and I think people might be sleeping on it just because, again, I get the feedback. People like, I hear that Darkness builds aren't that good. I'm like, dog, I don't know how you think that, but like, sure, absolutely. Like, keep thinking that so that they don't touch it. Aspect of Torment, another like kind of generally useless essence generation tool that we had previously, drastically increasing its bonus. So let's go ahead and like look at it right now. What it says is when you critically strike with a bone skill, you increase your essence generation by 30% for 4 seconds. And in the real game universe, with the average amount of willpower that a Necromancer has in your base essence generation, this basically meant that you went from 3 essence generation per second to 4 essence generation per second. So on a Bone Spear build, it just like generally increased your essence generation by roughly 33% of your base regens, like nothing else that actually cared about that. But it was like a pretty cool little thing to use until you had a really good exposed flesh. Now, obviously that's different in the season where it's just in your Codex of Power, but this largely meant that like this aspect just almost has no value at all. Changing it so that you can get up to 170% increase in your total essence generation opens this up as like a legitimately good option for Bone Spirit. Again, that was like one of the skills that just like had such a problem managing stuff and could only use Umbral. And now you have this. That's actually pretty decent. 170% bonus on 3 is a 2.7 is 6, roughly 8 to 9, like 9 essence gen per second if I'm doing my napkin math in my head very quickly. That's like pretty good, honestly. 8, even if it's like 7 or 8 essence gen per second, that's a marked increase in its overall effectiveness. I'm excited to see that, very specifically for Bone Spirit. For Bone Spirit 2, it's just kind of nice, again, until you have like a high roll exposed flesh. Then maybe you just use both of these in tangent and you can kind of skip Umbral in dealing with crowd control for your essence gen. That's pretty cool. I didn't think that Bone Spirit needed to be nerfed, but this definitely helps Bone Spirit to feel better right now. Also, depending on how this works with the Barber, because one of the issues that a lot of people are running into is that the Barber is stopping very specific lucky hit abilities, and I believe that this should be able to read the fact that the damage being dealt was from a critical strike, so this should work through the Barber. We'll have to test it, obviously. I haven't actually sat down with this aspect because you just generally didn't use it, but that's in general just like a good change. The hulking aspect is so wild. I'll be honest with you, I am not sure what the hulking aspect is legitimately meant to do. But right now it's a resource aspect. They are changing it over to a utility aspect, meaning it can go on shields, armor, helmets, etc. Right now it can only go onto your ring. And it says that your golem had a 4% chance to reduce its own active cooldown by 2 seconds, and a 2% chance to spawn a corpse each time it damages an enemy with its normal attack. This like almost had a use on a bone golem because a bone golem does a cleaving attack with its normal attack. None of the other ones do. So this meant that you could like generally increase your corpse generation by a very small amount. They're buffing it up so that the chance to generate a corpse is raised to 2.5%, and that the chance to reduce its cooldown is also increased to 5%. The reason why I'm confused is because any build that's looking to spam the Golem's like activated ability is using Abhorrent Decrepify for cooldown. So you just have it up literally every second because you're a build that is abusing a bunch of Lucky Hit to get Abhorrent Decrepify to proc a bunch. I quite literally don't know what this aspect is supposed to be used for, just across the board. They could make it so that the Golem had a 50% chance to reduce its active cooldown and a 20% chance to generate a corpse. And then like maybe this would be cool for corpse generation on bosses. Kinda. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what this is supposed to do, but at least it's not a resource aspect anymore, which does mean that it just became easier to actually gamble for resource aspects. I think that that's something I didn't realize up until this point, but it no longer being a resource aspect takes it out of the pool. So now you're more likely to get Umbral, you're more likely to get Exposed Flesh, you're more likely to get Torment, I guess, as well. So that's actually pretty cool. It takes it out of that pool. Greaves of the Empty Tomb are boots for the Necromancer that gives you max evade charges, which is pretty good. Gives you intelligence, so that increases your score, your base skill damage. Essence cost reduction, something you could already get on boots, but it's good that it comes on these. Lucky hit chance with shadow damage, which is why it sometimes gets used in Infinimus builds to be able to really crank up your lucky hit chance in total. And damage reduction from monsters who are shadowed right now, which is also very good. Like damage reduction for like a more easily applicable damage reduction type on boots is nice. Lucky hit chance is nice. Essence cost reduction, we'd love to see that. But you'll notice that they're boots that don't give you movement speed on the Necromancer, the class that is most starved for movement speed. Basically, these boots were dead on arrival, except in very specific niche cases for Infinimus for Lucky Hit. It also has this thing that says that Sever leaves behind an AoE dot, which is like kind of cool, helps with Shadow Blight procs. Realistically, it really didn't matter. But it doesn't have movement speed on them. Boots without movement speed is just the worst. It is the worst. That's why you've probably never used them. Now, they've removed intelligence, great choice, and they've added bonus movement speed so you can actually put these boots on. Sick. And then on top of that, now that they actually have movement speed, if you were to just find these in general, boots that come with movement speed, essence cost reduction, and then lucky hit and damage reduction, actually just like really solid boots. I think you're going to see these on a ton more builds. Maybe not every single build, because being able to put on like a better movement speed aspect on the boots is really nice. But in general, just boots that you can find with these 4 highly valuable stats with a unique stat that you can't typically get, lucky hit with shadow damage, just good boots now. Gonna be excited to find these. And then probably what the most people who are looking for Necromancer specific information were the most excited for is the changes to how minions are going to be interacting with AoE damage. So one of the biggest problems in the game right now is that your Necromancer minions, regardless of how tanky they are and how much minion health you have and how many Paragon nodes you put into, they just fall over to AoE damage. Just no question, if an AoE damage effect goes out, they sit down and they don't get back up. This basically meant that even Mendeln builds, like in the late game, if you came across a fire enchanted monster, you just didn't have minions. No matter how hard you tried, the immediate AoE would just blow through them for whatever reason. So now we need to see just how much tankier they are against these types of effects. But Balrogs with Fire Breath ability, as well as Elite Affix's Fire Enchanted, Electrified Obelisks, and Shock Lance are now going to deal significantly reduced damage to your Necromancer minions. This might still mean that you have to fully invest in their survivability, and it's not until the end game where you have like maximum minion life on your gear that they'll be able to stand toe to toe against these effects. But if that is the case, like if that is the reality, that based off these damage nerfs, they'll be able to do that, I consider that a win. I consider that a huge quality of life win for minion builds across the board, especially minion builds like in the earlier Nightmare dungeons where you just couldn't do anything to keep them alive unless you were forced to very specifically use Army of the Dead with Unyielding Commander and have that up with 100% maximum time to give them enough damage reduction to survive. And even in those cases, sometimes they just didn't. I'm glad to see these changes. It's a really good step in the correct direction. Now, this is, I think, arguably one of the most exciting changes that they've put into the game. You see Temerity here. Remember Temerity? They're the pants that for the last month, everybody's been asking, what do you think about Temerity? My answer has always been they're absolutely trash because they don't offer any survivability and because the base effect is actually bugged. And instead of getting max life and barrier, you only get your base life and barrier. Well, they apparently decided to make good on the promise of what that item is supposed to do. Not only that, they're swapping out a very key stat on the item to maximum life, which while most people are still going to want damage reduction on their pants, this is very exciting, specifically for the Bloodlance Necromancer and blood builds in general. So let's look at what Temerity does currently and then compare it to this. So Temerity right now says all stats, potion drop rate, lucky hit chance to heal, and healing received. On top of that, it has a unique ability that says that effects that heal you beyond your 100% life, so on a Bloodlance build, using Gore Quills to eat up all of your blood orbs for a huge amount of overhealing, are going to grant you barrier 80% of your maximum life that lasts for 8 seconds. The problem being that it does not work off of your maximum life. It only works off your base life. So if you had plus to maximum life here on all of your gear, it didn't continue to scale with that. So while it said max life, it was just wrong. It just didn't work that way. So the first biggest change is that the barrier now actually is based off of your maximum life. Here's the second part. They're replacing the all stats modifier right here, which is like fine. All stats on pants is like kind of, that's a lie. All stats on pants is just like absolutely trash. That being said, it gave us willpower, so it's sad to see that go. But it's now going to give maximum life as well. So Temerity, the pants, all about healing and maximum life and barrier, now also gives you maximum life. One of the most important, but also not necessarily most valuable survivability stats across the board, right? A lot of people would love for these pants to say 3 different types of damage reduction. But what I like about it having maximum life, healing receive, and chance to heal is that thematically the pants are doing something very unique that you would have to build around to get a benefit, which is ultimately what I think all unique items realistically should be. And now, since they give maximum life is the base value that scales overpower damage, because your maximum life or your current life and your current fortitude is the base damage that overpower scales off of. So now these pants gain a good survivability stat, maximum life, but on top of that, it's the most powerful stat for a blood build. Lastly, they changed it so that for whatever reason, when you had barrier from Temerity, your character wasn't considered to have a barrier for things like conceited, which would give you bonus damage based off of having a barrier. So that was like just kind of like a weird bug. So now that will work with it as well. So you can actually activate a pretty early game damage bonus just from wearing the pants. Now, I don't think that Temerity all of a sudden just makes it onto literally every single build, although on Druid builds, it absolutely has a lot more viability there. On Barbarian builds, which have a lot of maximum life, it has really good viability there. And then obviously on Blood builds, there is a universe where you could argue that these are the best in slot pants. Now, one of the downsides to this is that typically most necromancers are using the shielding storm aspect to be able to generate barrier proactively. Since you would be losing an aspect slot by using these pants, we now have to make that decision. Do we use shielding storm somewhere else? Kind of the funny part, or the good part, you can, label this however you want. Right now with the Barber Wrathful Heart, if you're using the Barber like I am inside of any of your items, this effect makes it, and you can very barely see it. You don't need to see the stats, it's not important. But because it begins absorbing damage, for whatever reason, Bone Storm, when it deals damage, cannot generate barrier from Shielding Storm. So right now on my Bloodlance Necromancer, since I'm using the Barber, I'm actually using the Protector, an aspect that just says you gain barrier whenever you attack an elite monster, as like a kind of stand-in for this effect. It's not great, but at least it works. But now we have an opportunity to be able to generate barrier without having to use Shielding Storm, which kind of reduces the stranglehold that Shielding Storm has on builds in general. I think that could be a true statement. Like, there is a universe where you could start swapping out to Temerity if your build is able to overheal effectively enough, since we also have the lucky hit chance to heal, and healing receive is also increased. I also like the fact that it has potion drop rate, just as like a cool stat that you can have on the pants. I like that in general. Screw me for liking flavorful stats, but I think that that's cool. But this is very interesting that it now can be used in these different places. Will it be the best in slot? Hard to say. Will it just be in general like pretty good for survivability until you have pants that say maximum life and 3 different types of damage reduction? Absolutely. I think this takes Temerity bare minimum from an item that you should never use on any build to a kind of slightly niche and obscure usability place. It works very well with blood builds, and I'm excited to see what it will look like once I have a really good roll on it, and whether or not like that maximum life is hitting high enough. So we didn't go over bug fixes at all in this stream. The bug fixes will be in the patch notes, which again are on 8/2, August 2nd, and then we'll learn everything that's in it. One of the things that's most noticeable is that in patch 1.1.1, they're going to fix Imperfectly Balanced. Look forward to 8/2 for the entirety of the patch notes, 8/8 for the patch to go live. Thank you so much. I hope hope that this gave some greater insight into the changes that are coming down the line, most notably for the Necromancer. Again, can't do a great job with Sorc and Barbarian, but at the very least, those were my thoughts on how the different changes to Necromancer are really going to impact play and the meta in general. So I hope that that helps. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I know nobody is watching at this point, but if you made it this far, you're an absolute soldier. Let me know down in the comments in organic opportunities for engagement. No, but seriously, thank you very much for watching the video. If you made it this far, I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.